Somewhere in occupied territory, a commando moves through total darkness toward a German sentry. The same Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife this channel has already told the story of, gripped tight in his hand, his breathing controlled, his approach silent, every step of his training bringing him to this exact moment. He gets close enough to strike, reaches for the sentry's throat, and something goes wrong that no amount of training could have prevented. In the dark, his hand cannot tell which side of the blade is actually the edge. According to reports that made their way back through official channels, more than one soldier in this exact situation ended up dragging the flat, dull side of the blade across a target's throat instead of the honed edge, in the one moment where silence and speed meant absolutely everything. The knife survived the war as a legend. The men who occasionally failed with it in the dark did not always survive to tell anyone why. If stories like this are worth your time, consider subscribing, and a like helps push this kind of research toward the people who will actually value it. Why would the man who designed the most famous fighting knife of the entire war decide his own creation needed to be rebuilt? Who was the young American officer trusted to help him do it? And what, specifically, kept going wrong in the field that a weapon this famous was somehow still failing the men who carried it? William Ewart Fairbairn had already built his reputation the hard way, running the Shanghai Municipal Police through some of the most violent street conditions of the 1920s and 30s, alongside his partner, Eric Sykes, personally involved in hundreds of documented street confrontations over the course of his career there. By the time he returned to Britain, his own body reportedly carried scars across his arms, legs, chest, and torso. Physical evidence of a career spent learning close combat through direct, personal experience rather than theory read from a manual. The knife he and Sykes eventually produced together became the standard against which every other fighting knife of the war was measured, issued to commandos, and prized enough that soldiers who never officially received one often went to considerable lengths to acquire their own. But Fairbairn was never entirely convinced the design was finished, and the man who eventually helped him prove that was an American who had not even joined the program yet when the knife first reached combat. Rex Applegate was born in Oregon in 1914 and joined the United States Army in 1940, developing close-quarters combat courses for troops at Camp Ritchie in Maryland, before being personally recruited by William Wild Bill Donovan into the newly formed Office of Strategic Services. His assignment was almost absurdly specific for a man barely out of his 20s: build and run what internal OSS documents referred to as the School for Spies and Assassins, on ground that today houses the presidential retreat at Camp David. To actually learn what he needed to teach, Applegate was sent across the Atlantic to study directly under Fairbairn himself, absorbing years of hard-won Shanghai street experience in a compressed course of instruction. Their working relationship reportedly began with a lesson in humility rather than formal instruction. Applegate volunteered, or more accurately voluntold, to help demonstrate a technique during one of Fairbairn's training sessions, and found himself thrown bodily across the room by a man twice his age and considerably smaller in stature. A blunt introduction to exactly how much this older Englishman actually knew. What Applegate learned after that first humbling lesson went well beyond hand-to-hand technique. He began collecting after-action reports from soldiers who had actually carried the Fairbairn-Sykes dagger into combat, reading through accounts submitted from multiple theaters, and the pattern that emerged troubled him considerably. The blade itself, ground thin and narrow for maximum penetration, proved genuinely difficult to sharpen properly in field conditions and prone to snapping under lateral stress, particularly if it struck bone or was used for anything beyond a clean thrust. The round, tapered handle, elegant on a parade ground and reminiscent of a fencing foil's grip, slipped easily in a sweating or bloodied hand and gave a soldier absolutely no physical way to confirm, purely by feel, in total darkness, which side of the blade was actually sharp. Applegate documented the consequence himself in his own later writing on the subject, describing reports of men attempting to silently cut a sentry's throat, and instead dragging the flat, unsharpened face of the blade across the target. A catastrophic failure, at exactly the moment silence was the entire point of carrying a knife, instead of a firearm in the first place. In late 1943, Fairbairn and Applegate sat down together to correct what the battlefield had already exposed. Working as instructor and former student, now collaborating as genuine equals, they widened and thickened the blade, using higher carbon steel, sacrificing a small amount of the original's needle-thin profile in exchange for a point far less likely to snap the first time it struck bone or heavy fabric during actual use, rather than a controlled demonstration. They replaced the round, slippery handle with an oval cross-section grip, a shape a hand could instantly read in complete darkness, immediately confirming blade orientation without a single wasted second of hesitation at exactly the moment hesitation could get a man killed. A brass crossguard, swept forward rather than sitting flat against the hand, kept a soldier's thumb from slamming directly into the guard during a hard thrust, solving a second, smaller injury risk nobody had bothered documenting as carefully as the throat-cutting failures that had prompted the whole redesign in the first place. The redesigned knife never reached mass production during the war itself, despite the two men having solved the exact problems soldiers were reporting from the field. Applegate first approached Randall-made knives, the same small Orlando workshop, already building custom fighting knives for soldiers writing in directly from the front lines, with their own money in hand. And Beau Randall built a handful of prototypes based on his own existing Model 2 dagger pattern, sending them out for field testing among troops already familiar with his other combat knives. The response from soldiers was lukewarm at best, and Randall ultimately declined to pursue production any further, unwilling to commit his already stretched workshop to a design that had not generated the kind of enthusiastic word of mouth his other knives routinely earned. With wartime industrial capacity already stretched thin, producing tanks, aircraft, and rifles by the millions, a refined fighting knife simply never climbed high enough on anyone's procurement priority list, and the corrected design Fairbairn and Applegate had built together sat largely dormant in a drawer for the remainder of the conflict, its improvements essentially undocumented outside a small circle of people who already knew what problem it had been built to solve. It would take nearly 4 decades for the design to find its way into actual production. In the early 1980s, Applegate revived the concept commercially, working first with a small-scale knife maker known as T.J. Yancey, before custom bladesmith Bill Harsey took over refining the pattern further. And Applegate eventually licensed the finished design to established manufacturers, including Almar Knives, Blackjack Knives, Gerber Legendary Blades, and the German firm Boker. The knife that finally reached soldiers and collectors under the Applegate-Fairbairn name carried an 11-inch overall length built around a 6-inch blade, a handle now commonly molded from durable Lexan or Delrin plastic, fitted with removable lead weights that let an individual owner fine-tune the weapon's balance point to their own hand, a level of personal customization the original 1940s design never offered anyone. Boker continues producing versions of the Applegate-Fairbairn knife today, reportedly still finding use among German Special Forces units more than 8 decades after the field failures that originally inspired its redesign. A genuinely unusual lifespan for a piece of individual combat equipment, first sketched out on a workbench in the middle of a world war. Applegate himself went on to write extensively on close combat doctrine, most notably in his book Kill or Get Killed, a text that became required reading for generations of military and law enforcement personnel long after its author had stopped teaching in person, cementing a legacy built as much on correcting his own mentor's most famous creation as on anything he ever designed entirely from scratch on his own. Fairbairn, for his part, lived to see the beginnings of that legacy take shape, though he would not survive long enough to witness the commercial version of the knife that carried both their names finally reach the hands of the soldiers it had originally been built to protect. There is something quietly remarkable about a teacher secure enough in his own reputation to let a former student point out exactly where his most celebrated design had failed real soldiers in real darkness, and then sit down and fix it together, rather than defend it out of pride. The Fairbairn-Sykes knife earned its legend fairly, proving itself again and again in the hands of commandos who trusted it with their lives. The Applegate-Fairbairn knife exists only because that legend was never treated as finished business by the one man on earth who actually had the standing to say otherwise. And the student who had once been thrown across a room for volunteering was, a few years later, trusted enough to help rebuild it from the ground up. That's the story of a perfect weapon that wasn't, and the student trusted enough to help his teacher admit it. See you next time. Stay safe.